Subscribe before the truth disappears. They say a 30-year-old cold case is a dead language, no one left to speak it, only echoes on the walls. But on a gray November morning in Fairfax County, Virginia, the language of violence was fresh and wet and unignorable. Laurie stood on the back deck, knuckles white against the sliding door frame. No answer at the front, no movement through the glass. Only the tidy stillness of a family home that should have been noisy with cartoons and a toddler's laughter. Then she saw it, the thin surgical slice in the screen, a violation in a geometry of everyday life. Panic crawled up her spine. She slipped through the cut and climbed inside. The house breathed a strange quiet. It wasn't the calm of sleep. It was the quiet after something terrible has made sound illegal. Laurie moved down the hallway, calling out, breath-catching, the carpet brushing her ankles like tall grass in a bad dream. That's when the child appeared, Nicole, 2 years old, eyes wide, expression drained as if she had spent a weekend talking to shadows and ran out of words. The master bedroom doorway stood open like a mouth. Laurie looked in and saw the story written in dark strokes on the wall. She didn't need the details to know the body in the room had once been her friend. She didn't need to count the wounds or trace the patterns. Her body took over. Out, phone, call, police, now. By the time the first detective arrived, the house was already dividing itself into before and after. A cut screen, a bedroom battlefield, a phone with its cords severed, communication physically denied. The child's trail, tissues scattered like little white flags of mercy, led back to the bed as if she'd been trying to fix what no child should ever have to see. Empty baby bottles placed beside her mother as if hunger and love could negotiate with death. The detectives did their slow, hard work. They marked the points of entry, the swirl of a struggle, the unstolen valuables. They read the silence for motive, the careful cut of a screen for intent. A washcloth hung in the bathroom, quiet as a held breath, a small brown stain, a whisper in a room of screams. It went into a bag, then into a chain of custody, then into a freezer, then into a future no one could yet imagine. Elsewhere, miles away in another world entirely, Ollie stared at a hotel wall in the Bahamas and tried to make sense of a phone call that cracked his life open. He had been dialing and dialing all weekend, catching only rings and voicemails, trying to reach his wife Robin, a gifted artist, a mother, a woman whose work once honored Rosa Parks. He would learn the news in a voice that never wanted to carry it. Back home, the family would assemble in the ruins of their certainty. A father who thought a war and now faced a different kind of enemy. A sister and brother who barely knew which questions to ask because any answer seemed unbearable. A little girl who had already seen more than any mind could hold. The first wave of suspicion, like always, rolled toward the husband. Investigators traced his travel, tested his alibi, asked where he'd been, who he'd loved. There was an affair, a detail that made the narrative click too easily into place for some. But alibis were checked, timelines stapled, and the brittle ease of the obvious gave way to something colder and harder. The truth wasn't going to be simple. So the case did what unsolved cases do. It sat. It gathered time the way old houses gathered dust, quietly, inevitably. Detectives rotated. Boxes were shelved. CODIS, our National Library of DNA, took the washcloth's whisper and compared it to millions of voices. Nothing spoke back. Years passed, then more years. The edges frayed on memories. Witnesses moved, retired, forgot. But grief has its own kind of stamina. It doesn't stop. It learns to walk with you. The family carried Robin in the ways that remained. In art hung on walls and in the curled corners of photographs. In the way a niece learned to love the world loudly because an aunt once showed her how. The little girl grew up. The father tried to set down what couldn't be set down. A closed casket sealed a chapter no one got to read through to the end. Decades later, the file came back into the light. Cold case detectives, a new pair of eyes, 2 names, Wallace and Long. They pulled the evidence, turned pages that crackled, and discovered that the washcloth had never stopped talking. The world had merely lacked the translation. Genealogical DNA, once a hobby for curious cousins, had become a lever that could move time. A lab, Parabon, would take that ancient whisper break it into fragments, and send it into two databases where strangers carry pieces of one another without knowing. The returns weren't generous. No obvious cousin, no second or third, only a constellation of distant relations, faded as postcards from the 1800s. A solvability score of 0, they were told. It was like trying to map a city by the shadows it casts at noon. Then came the volunteer, Liz. No badge, no paycheck, just a stubborn streak and a mind that did not quit. She took on the math and the history, the births and marriages spanning continents and centuries. She traced the bloodlines back to a couple whose names were now more genealogy than memory. She had two trees that didn't touch, but she knew they had to. And then one day, they did. A marriage. A union that bent two branches into one. From that union, somewhere down the line, she argued, came a man whose DNA rode on a washcloth 30 years earlier, a man whose face might look like the phenotyping sketch, with its fair skin, strong jaw, and eyes like winter water. While she worked the past, detectives tried to conjure a face in the present. The lab built a model. Dark blue eyes, lighter brown hair, a youthful composite because DNA has no calendar. They showed it to Ollie on a video call, hoping for that cinematic moment, recognition, a name, a door to kick down. He didn't see anyone he knew. The sketch went up on the wall anyway, not a portrait, but a placeholder for a person who had once cut through a screen and stepped into a life he had no right to enter. The months accumulated and the case waited, a chessboard mid-game. Imagine being a detective in that space. You live between beats, between the knock on a door and the answer, between we think and we know. The washcloth remained, faithful and mute. The phone with its severed cord remained, a relic of an interrupted plea. The child's tissues remained, devastating in their smallness. And yet the case breathed, quietly at first, then audibly. In April 2021, the review became a mission. The notes sharpened. The timeline got teeth. The detectives put their faith in two kinds of persistence, the databases and the humans. CODIS had given them silence. Genealogy offered a murmur. A volunteer folded time. A family held on. Then in August 2023, after years of spare time labor and night after night diving into records that looked like static to everyone else, a single message arrived like a flare through fog. I think I found someone of interest. It wasn't just a name, it was a life with edges that didn't match the monster anyone expected. A computer programmer in upstate New York, married to a defense attorney, 2 kids, a lawn, a quiet street. Not so much as a speeding ticket. The kind of profile that makes detectives look at each other and say, no way, even as experience tells them, evil is often well-groomed and punctual. But there was a yearbook photo, 16 years old, a face that looked unnervingly like the lab's composite geometry aged backward. The jaw, the eyes, the echo of a mask no one could see anymore. So 2 detectives got on a plane. No warrant, no theatrics, just a knock on a door and the calm introduction of people who have learned that the best way to break a 30-year silence is to ask a question like it's the most ordinary thing in the world. Do you mind if we come in and talk? The man didn't ask many questions. He signed, he swabbed. 5 minutes in and out as if none of this mattered, as if you were already rehearsing a different scene. Back at the hotel, the detectives exhaled. The washcloth's whisper would soon speak in a lab's dialect of certainty. But before the results, before the ink could dry on any report, Detective Wallace's phone lit up with an unfamiliar number and a voice she would never forget. I'm at the police department to turn myself in. For what? For the murder. 30 years is a long time to live with a secret. Some secrets devour you. Some you feed. This one, it seems, had been eating from both sides. And that is where the past stopped whispering and started to shout.
The phone call landed like a thunderclap in a quiet room. I'm at the police department to turn myself in. Detective Wallace stared at the screen as if the words might rearrange into something ordinary. They didn't. She pounded on Long's hotel door with the flat of her hand. The corridor smelled like old carpet and travel soap and adrenaline. He's turning himself in, she said. Now. The next sequence unraveled with a kind of terrible grace. Local officers met him first, a small-town station still locked for the night. Then uniforms, keys, the jangle of procedure. The detectives arrived to see a man whose life looked like an advertisement for stability. Crisp polo, clean nails, A face that would disappear in any crowd of PTA fathers and weekend grass cutters. He sat with his hands folded as if waiting for a dentist. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Smirk," Wallace said, easing into a chair. He nodded once. "Before we get into anything, we're going to read you your rights." Another nod. No questions, no visible irritation, just the chill of someone who had moved past surprise long ago and found a comfortable chair in inevitability. They began the interview the way you begin a descent. Slow, purposeful, checking the gauges as you go. Name, address, work, a spouse who practiced law, 2 children with school photos magneted on a stainless refrigerator. A suburb where every cul-de-sac had a speed bump, and a mailman who waved by first name. "What do you want to talk to us about?" Long asked finally, his voice the tone of a man asking for the time. "The woman," he said, "in Virginia." "Robin?" A flicker, barely a ripple, moved across his face and then was gone. Yes. He didn't trade in theatrics. He didn't unspool history like a monologue. He delivered his truth in tidy parcels, each one wrapped in that dry voice, like he was cataloging hardware in a drawer. He had been 22, Army, stationed at Fort Myer. Drinking beer that night, he said. Ephedrine pills, too. Small white accelerants he washed down for energy, for clarity, for the kick he mistook for control. He knew the neighborhood. He'd visited friends nearby. He drove there because he could, because the compound of restlessness and anger had become its own math, and the equation required a solution. "Did you bring anything with you?" Wallace asked. He admitted, a mask, gloves, a knife. The room shrank a notch, as interrogation rooms do when the truth stops playing coy. Wallace wrote the items down, though she'd never forget them. Ski mask, leather gloves, knife. "How did you get into the house?" Long asked. "Back deck. Screen was easy to cut." He spoke about hallways as if reciting the schematic of a childhood home. He moved along the axis of memory with an engineer's economy. Turn, bedroom, bed, phone, cord. He gave no flourishes, no adjectives for the blood, no metaphor for struggle. The words stacked themselves like cinder blocks, useful, gray, heavy. "Did you injure yourself?" Wallace asked, and this was the line she wanted to cross, the bridge she needed to stand on. The bathroom, the washcloth, the whisper that had waited 30 decades for a mouth to speak it. He paused. Not long, just long enough for a thought to check its reflection. "Yes," he said. "I cut myself." A beat. The air in the room recalibrated, and Wallace's head, the washcloth, lifted itself off the chrome rod into a gloved hand. A small brown stain became a red, immediate moment. The whisper took on volume. He was in the bathroom, he bled, he cleaned. She kept her face still, her pen moving. Where? Bathroom. How? Knife slipped. He did not apologize. He did not narrate remorse. He placed facts on the table like cards he'd decided didn't matter anymore. When Long asked, not unkindly, if he had anything he wished to say to the family, the answer was a vacancy padded in words, a refusal dressed as calm. If you've ever watched a confession happen in real time, you know it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like stepping into a room where a terrible noise was made long ago and hearing the echo arrive, late, exact, unavoidable. Wallace thought of the child in the hallway with the tissues. She thought of the washcloth that had done its job twice, once to wipe a wound and once to prove a man. When they ended the interview, they walked out of the room and did what seasoned detectives always do after a seismic moment. They worked. Paperwork, calls, notifications that would cross state lines. Then, because there is no justice without process, they waited for the lab. The washcloth had traveled a pilgrimage of evidence. It had been bagged by a young detective with a camera on a November afternoon. It had slept in a freezer. It had been woken up for CODIS and ignored by millions of profiles.
It had stood in the fluorescent light of a modern lab like an old witness finally invited to testify. Now technicians set to work again, methodical, careful, making sure the bridge between the bathroom and the man in the chair could hold a courtroom's weight. While they waited, the story tugged at older threads. The volunteer Liz, who had stitched together the past by lantern light and stubbornness, sat at her kitchen table and read the email from Wallace. "We have a confession." She looked at the two family trees taped to the wall, the Canadian ancestors, the marriage that fused them, and the long downward tangle that had ended in a name. She allowed herself a long breath, the kind you take when the map finally agrees with the road. Across town, decades downstream from the cut screen and the severed phone cord, a father who had outlived wars, but not grief, answered a call. His grandchild was a woman now, the toddler in the hallway all grown. She listened with a face that learned to be brave early and said she would tell the others. Families have their own chain of custody, and this is how news moves through it. Sister to brother, cousin to cousin, each voice carrying a little more steadiness than last. In the lab, the math completed itself. The alleles lined up with the stubborn beauty of a solved chord. Statistics gathered along the edges like courtroom ushers. 1 in millions odds condensed into the only number that matters. Match.
The official language said what everyone in that small interrogation room already knew. The washcloth and the man were not strangers. The next hearing unfolded in a fluorescent box where calendars rule all. A judge, a prosecutor whose tone had the cold steel of someone who has cataloged too many ways a life can end. A defense attorney, ironies intact, doing her work. The family sat behind the rail and tried to keep their breathing quiet. The tape of the confession, now evidence, made the air thicken. Words that had been born in a carpeted interview room now wore the solemn clothes of the record. From the pews, Lauren, niece, now woman, measured the man with her eyes and realized how big he was. She thought of her aunt's strength and the physics of the body, how sometimes the bravest fighting doesn't translate to victorious force. She squeezed Nicole's hand. This is what solidarity looks like in courtrooms. Fingers laced, eyes forward, jaws set. Outside, cameras gathered like scavenger birds that had learned to be gentle. Statements were given, justice words, closure words, the vocabulary of official relief that never quite fits the private ache. Reporters nodded, pens moving, mics extended. Then the courthouse swallowed the day back into itself and sent everyone home with their individual versions of the same night. A dinner eaten quickly, a door locked twice, the lights checked, a bed that promised nothing beyond sleep's temporary mercy. Later, Smirk's life was poured into legal vessels, mitigation narratives, diagnoses, the strange consolations of chemical explanations. Alcohol, ephedrine, a mood disorder described with Roman numerals. Explanations are not excuses, but they are sturdy. People lean on them so they don't fall. For Wallace and Long, the endgame had a different texture. They returned to the house on a cold afternoon and stood again near the back deck, at the angle where a man once looked through glass and made a decision. The screen had long since been replaced, the family long moved on, the neighborhood staged over with new toys and newer cars. The detectives faced the old entry point and permitted the smallest of victories to climb out of the quiet. A stain had spoken, and the world had listened. Before they left, Wallace placed a hand against the siding and thought of the artifacts that had conspired to survive. The washcloth, the tissues, the phone with its cut cord. It struck her that each object had tried, in its way, to do what it was made to do: clean, comfort, connect. The intruder tried to make them fail. Time tried to make them irrelevant, but they endured long enough to testify. Justice is never really a door slamming. It is a hinge that stops squeaking. It is a house that exhales after 30 winters. The sentence would come later, the number big enough to feel like a wall. The plea would sidestep the theater of a trial the family wanted, trading spectacle for certainty. And still, there would be questions that the record could not hold. Why this house? Why that night? Why the mask? Why the knife? Why a life that looked so ordinary built over a fault line no one saw? Some stories end with a gavel. This one doesn't. Not yet. Because before justice can say the last word, there is one more voice you need to hear. From the only person who stood in that house and survived the weekend with memory half-formed and a baby bottle in her hand. Next, the daughter speaks.
For nearly 3 decades, Nicole Lawrence had lived in the soft shadow of a story she was too young to remember, but too old to escape. In family photographs, she's the little girl with wide, unreadable eyes, the same eyes that once met Laurie's on that November morning in 1994, framed by the dim hallway and the smell of blood and baby powder. Now she sat in the front row of a Virginia courtroom, 30 years older, 30 years stronger, 30 years quieter. The reporters didn't know what to make of her. She didn't cry, she didn't fidget. She just held her cousin Lauren's hand like a steadying heartbeat, her gaze fixed, not on the killer, but on the floor, the one thing that hadn't changed since that night. Nicole had spent most of her childhood with memories that felt like dreams someone else had dreamed. A flash of red fabric, a voice calling her name, the cold touch of linoleum beneath her feet. She never spoke of it, not to therapists, not to friends, not even to her father. There were some memories that feel like broken glass. Once you pick them up, you can't stop bleeding. But the day Detective Wallace called, the silence cracked. She remembered the tone in Wallace's voice, firm, careful, reverent, like someone trying to hand her something fragile. "We've identified him," Wallace had said. Nicole's world didn't tilt or break. It just exhaled. She didn't ask for his name. She didn't need to. The word closure had always felt like a stranger's idea, something people said to make sense of their own discomfort. But what Nicole wanted wasn't closure. It was truth, the kind that sits beside you at night and no longer whispers. After her mother's murder, Nicole grew up with her father, Ollie, a man who carried grief like a polite secret. He'd cook dinner, help with homework, and then retreat into the kind of quiet that hums. He didn't remarry. He didn't move from the house until Nicole left for college. In that house, Robin's art still hung on the walls. The Rosa Parks metal sketch framed above the mantel, the pastel portraits stored in the guest room closet. They became relics of a world that had ended mid-sentence. Every once in a while, Nicole would wake in the middle of the night and hear her father talking softly in the living room. He wasn't praying, he was remembering. When she turned 16, she visited her mother's grave for the first time alone. The sky that day looked eerily like the photographs of the crime scene, pale, washed, indifferent. She placed the small washcloth beside the headstone, not because she remembered it, but because she understood its meaning. The thing that once held his blood had also carried her salvation. When Stefan Smirk stood before the court in 2025, Nicole didn't look at him until the sentence was read. 70 years, with parole. He nodded once, as if acknowledging a meeting that had gone exactly as scheduled. Nicole rose, the wooden bench creaking under the weight of decades. She didn't approach him, didn't shout, didn't tremble. She just said softly, so softly the judge barely heard her, "You didn't just kill her. You built my life out of her absence." For the first time, Smirk looked at her, and for the first time he blinked. Outside the courthouse, the cameras wanted tears. They wanted quotes. They wanted an ending. But Nicole gave them none. She stood with Lauren, hand in hand, both facing the same direction, toward the long horizon of living that follows every verdict. Detective Wallace often said that the Robin Lawrence case taught her something she hadn't learned in 20 years of police work. Quote, "Justice doesn't fix time. It just makes it stand still long enough for people to breathe again." That spring, Nicole visited her mother's old art studio, now a modest community space with fresh white walls and quiet light. She opened a box labeled Robin's Originals and found sketches of faces, hundreds of them. People in train stations, markets, classrooms. Ordinary strangers captured with extraordinary tenderness. On the final page, unfinished, was a pencil sketch of a little girl looking up at a woman's silhouette. The girl's eyes were wide and uncertain, but her mouth almost smiled. Nicole traced the outline and whispered, "I remember now." The house where it all happened still stands, repainted and rebuilt. A new family lives there. The screen on the back deck is intact, the lawn manicured, the mailbox repainted in cheerful blue. Sometimes, on early mornings, neighbors say they see a woman walking past. Tall, graceful, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. No one knows her name. But those who know the story say the air feels different when she passes, like a house exhaling after 30 winters. The Robin Lawrence case is over, but her light, through her daughter, through her art, still paints the world she never got to finish. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.